Tallahassee, Florida, a quiet suburb where life usually flows peacefully and measured. But one day, something happened that shook the entire community. A local university professor was found unconscious in the driveway of his own house, bleeding profusely. This man is Daniel Eric Markel, a father of 2 young boys who had everything to live for. The police found themselves at a dead end. No evidence, no suspects, no DNA, only one unreliable witness. It became clear that this case would not be simple and quick. It would require all the experience and patience of the investigators to solve it. Dan was born in 1972 in Toronto, Canada. He was a smart and successful man. He studied at prestigious universities, including Cambridge, and in 2001, he received a law degree from Harvard. After that, he worked as a clerk at a law firm for several years. In 2005, he got an opportunity he couldn't pass up. The University of Florida's law school was looking for a professor with the same qualifications as Dan. He jumped at this chance and was a perfect fit for his new career at the university. Daniel Markel had all the prerequisites for a happy life and a successful career. But unfortunately, one tragic event crossed out all his plans. On the one hand, Dan loved teaching, and on the other, he was in love with criminal law. Despite his busy schedule teaching various legal disciplines, he found time to write numerous works in the field of criminal law. But it wasn't just career successes that brought joy to Dan's life. He met his love, Wendy Adelson, on a dating site for single Jews. Despite their age difference, Dan was 33 and Wendy was 26. They were a perfect match for each other. Wendy was also passionate about criminal law and later, just like Dan, started teaching at the University of Florida. Their relationship developed rapidly, and the couple couldn't wait to get married. In a short time, they got to know each other well, got engaged, and finally tied the knot on February 26, 2006. The couple lived an ideal life. They both had their dream jobs, a good income, and in 2009, they welcomed their firstborn, followed by a second son. In 2010, life seemed wonderful, and it continued that way until 2012, when their relationship fell apart and they divorced. It seemed that Dan and Wendy had everything for a happy family life: love, common interests, successful career, children. But sometimes, even in the strongest relationships, at first glance, cracks appear that lead to the destruction of the marriage. The couple carefully concealed all the details of their divorce, so no one knows for sure why their marriage fell apart. In 2013, they officially divorced, and the image they presented to the public did not reflect the real situation in their family at all. Once, Dan went on a business trip, and when he returned home, he was shocked by what he saw. The house was almost completely emptied out. Wendy left only a few things, including a mattress. It took her just a day, while Dan was away, to move everything out of the house. Usually, moving out of a house is a stressful process that requires careful planning. But judging by how far Wendy went in emptying their shared home, she had been thinking about it long before. This indicates the deplorable state their marriage was in. And as if that wasn't enough, Wendy left Dan another gift on the mattress, a stack of divorce papers. The divorce process was very difficult, and Wendy had plenty of reasons to be angry. Obviously, she did everything possible to cause Dan as much suffering as possible during this process. Divorce is always a painful process, especially when the couple cannot agree amicably. But such outright hostility and a desire to hurt a former partner is an alarming sign. Wendy went even further in her desire to erase Dan from her life and the lives of their children. She changed the children's last name to her maiden name and even changed the name of one of her sons, which was given in honor of Dan's deceased relative. The divorce was not easy for Wendy, and she made every effort to erase any mention of Dan. It's one thing when a couple realizes that they can no longer be together, but it's another thing entirely when children are involved. They will still have to maintain contact. Attempts to isolate children from one of the parents look like cruel revenge. In 2014, Dan and Wendy lived separately. Wendy took up writing and wrote a book about human trafficking based on her experience. But it seems that her approach to writing was different from Dan's, and the book turned out to be a complete failure. Critics described it as terribly bad, so it was hardly worth rushing to the bookstore for this masterpiece. On July 18, 2014, Dan, as usual, was heading to Wendy's house to pick up the children and take them to kindergarten. This was part of his usual daily routine. In divorce situations, one of the parties often starts behaving irrationally, driven by emotions, but it's important to remember that children should not become hostages of adult conflicts. They have the right to communicate with both parents, regardless of how the relationship between the former spouses turned out. That morning, Dan followed his usual routine. He went to the gym, stopped by a few stores, nothing unusual. But soon everything was about to change dramatically. Around 11 o'clock, Dan finished his business and returned home. As he was approaching his house, he noticed that someone was already waiting for him there. At that moment, Dan was talking to someone on the phone. This interlocutor later told the police about their conversation and what he managed to hear and understand. According to him, whoever the person waiting for Dan was, they had obviously set up an ambush. There was no dialogue between them. Only a loud bang rang out before Dan even had time to open the car door. The bullet flew through the driver's side window and hit Dan right in the face. The impact was so strong that his head was thrown back against the headrest. One of the neighbors accidentally heard the shot and saw a gruesome picture. Dan was sitting motionless behind the wheel, surrounded by broken glass, with the interior and windshield covered in blood. Without wasting a second, the neighbor called 911. In such situations, it is very important for eyewitnesses to immediately call the emergency services. Every minute can be decisive in saving a life, and although the neighbor acted absolutely correctly, unfortunately, it is not always possible to get comprehensive information from witnesses in a state of shock. The neighbor said that he saw a car pull into the driveway and then heard a shot. Looking out the window, he saw Dan in critical condition in the front seat of the car. The man was still alive but could not call for help. The neighbor also noted that he could not say with certainty whether it was a suicide attempt or if someone had shot Dan. But in any case, the victim needed immediate help. While the ambulance was on its way, the police tried to get all possible information from the neighbor. However, the only thing he could report was that he saw a silver Toyota Prius leaving the scene immediately after the shot. Of course, the police should have followed up on this lead, but it is quite possible that it was just a random car passing by. The medics arrived 19 minutes later and urgently transported Dan to the nearest hospital. Unfortunately, an unfortunate mistake occurred. The dispatcher who took the call from the neighbor did not convey the information about the victim's critical condition. That's why it took the ambulance so long to get to the scene. And with a gunshot wound to the face, every minute counts. Sometimes the smallest mistake or oversight can cost a person their life, especially when it comes to such serious injuries as a gunshot wound to the head. It's a pity that valuable time was wasted due to a lack of communication between the services. We will never know for sure whether the delay in the ambulance's arrival affected the tragic outcome, but the fact remains, Dan could not survive the injuries he sustained. He fought for his life in the intensive care unit for 14 hours, but unfortunately, his heart stopped. Now the police were faced with an incredibly difficult task. A man who seemingly had no enemies and was loved by many was ruthlessly shot dead on the doorstep of his own home. And the only lead was a mysterious silver Toyota Prius that might have been involved in the crime, or might have had nothing to do with it at all. Shortly after the tragedy, a memorial service was held in Dan's memory. That day, many people gathered. Friends, relatives, students, all those who wanted to express their love, respect, and gratitude to the talented professor. The police were at a crossroads. Without evidence or suspects, they needed to decide where to start the investigation. The first person to fall under suspicion was Dan's ex-wife, Wendy Adelson. She was called to the police station on the day of her husband's murder. Wendy was not arrested, but for the police, it was a starting point. Before the interrogation, the woman listened to a voice message from a friend who worked as a realtor. Often in investigations of this kind, the victim's closest people become the first suspects. And although this is not always fair, you have to start somewhere. Any little thing can be the key to solving the crime. In the voice message, the friend said, "Hey Wendy, I feel a little awkward telling you this, and I don't want to dramatize the situation, but there was a shooting today near your former house. I hope you're okay, my dear." It went on to say how sorry the friend was that Wendy had to find out about it this way. But the fact remains, there was a shooting near her former residence. The ex-husband was critically wounded and was unlikely to survive. Upon hearing this, Wendy became extremely upset and burst into tears. She said that she had been emailing Dan that morning and everything was fine. Then the woman asked the investigators what happened to her ex-husband. The police officer replied that he could not disclose any details until he found out where she was at the time of the shooting. This is a standard procedure to exclude her from the list of suspects. Wendy responded very emotionally, but at the same time, somewhat detached. She reported that she had only left the house at noon on some business. She even wanted to drive past her former street, but saw that it was blocked off. The behavior of suspects during the first interrogation can tell an experienced investigator a lot. Unnatural emotionality, excessive detachment, unnecessary detailing of their actions, all this may indicate a desire to hide something. However, people react differently to stress, so it is too early to draw final conclusions. When the police asked Wendy if she knew anyone who might wish Dan harm, she just continued to cry bitterly. Finally, she replied that although Dan sometimes didn't treat people in the best way, she couldn't imagine anyone daring to be so cruel to him. The investigator inquired whether Dan owed anyone money. Through tears, Wendy replied that in fact, it was her ex-husband who owed her money child support. Wendy seemed genuinely shocked by the tragedy. She was almost going crazy with grief. The officer conducting the interrogation treated her very carefully and sympathetically. The problem for the police was that they still had no solid leads. The robbery version seemed unlikely since the attacker did not try to enter Dan's house, did not search for valuables in his car or pockets. At that moment, the investigators had only one possible motive: revenge. But why would someone want to take revenge on Dan? Could Wendy be right in assuming that he might have offended someone or done something improper? It's one thing to annoy a person, but it's quite another to drive someone to the point where they would pull out a gun in broad daylight and shoot you in cold blood. In murder investigations, it is very important to correctly identify the motive for the crime. This helps narrow down the list of suspects and understand in which direction to move further. However, sometimes we are faced with situations where there is no rational motive, and then you have to dig deeper, look for non-obvious connections and hidden conflicts. In search of at least some leads, the police decided to appeal to the public. They made it clear this was a deliberate murder, and they announced an immediate reward for those who provide information that would help arrest and convict the criminals. The reward amount started at $10,000, but later increased to $25,000. Some time after the sworn testimony was made public, it turned out that, according to the investigators, the suspect Garcia had an accomplice, 33-year-old Luis Rivera. It was assumed that this couple left Miami on July 16-17 in a rented silver Toyota Prius and moved around Florida. The police gathered snippets of information about these two: cell phone data, electronic records, video footage from surveillance cameras from various buildings and buses in the area. The video, it was believed, captured a couple who were following Dan Markel on July 18 as he went about his daily business, driving from kindergarten to the gym, then to the store and home. But why did these two suddenly become suspects? And why did they decide to kill a man with whom they seemingly had never crossed paths before? The police suspected that it was a contract killing. Someone paid Garcia and Rivera to kill Dan Markel, and most interestingly, this information came from a secret informant whose identity was never revealed. Thus, the key question remains unanswered. If it really was a contract murder, then who was the customer? It seems that the time has come to shed light on this mystery. Contract killings are perhaps the most difficult to investigate. After all, the real criminal hides behind the backs of the direct perpetrators. Finding a connection between the killer and the customer, proving their collusion, that's the real challenge for investigators. Especially if you have to work with anonymous informants whose motives are not always clear. No matter how much Garcia and Rivera were paid for their work, it turned out to be not enough for them to take all the blame. As soon as they realized that the game was over, they immediately began to sing like canaries during police interrogations. They told investigators that they were hired by none other than Charlie and Donna Adelson, the brother and mother of Dan's ex-wife. At first glance, these two were respectable members of society who together ran the Adelson Dental Clinic and Institute. By the way, I apologize if I mispronounced their last name. Charlie was a dentist, and Donna was in charge of patient care. It's hard to believe, but these testimonies alone were not enough to bring Charlie and Donna to justice. After all, as far as the police knew, the murder suspects could name any names in a desperate attempt to save their own skin. And what connection could there be between a respected family doctor, the owner of a dental clinic, and two hit men from Miami? Strangely, it took a long time to unravel this tangle. In the end, the missing link turned out to be a woman named Catherine Magbanua. She not only had an affair with Charlie Adelson, but also had a previous relationship with Sigfrido Garcia, from whom she had 2 children. Phone records showed that almost immediately after Dan Markel's murder, Catherine received a call from Luis Rivera, probably to report that the order had been carried out. Catherine was the only connecting link between all the participants in the conspiracy. Rivera, Garcia, and Adelson claimed that they had never met each other in person before. For her services as an intermediary, Catherine received $100,000. After analyzing Magbanua's bank account, it was established that over 12 months, she made deposits amounting to tens of thousands of dollars. Often, the key to solving high-profile murders lies in seemingly insignificant details and minor figures. It is important not only to focus on the main suspects, but also to carefully track all their connections and contacts. After all, that's where you can find the missing puzzles that will make up the complete picture of the crime. These suspicious transactions on Catherine's account began a few months before Dan Markel's murder and continued for several months after the crime. Isn't this the height of recklessness? Interestingly, the payments were almost always made in the form of checks. Not the smartest move on the part of the Adelson family, don't you think? After all, checks are very easy to track for one simple reason: they always have a signature. And every such check deposited into Magbanua's account was signed by none other than Donna Adelson. Hatred is perhaps too strong a word, but in this case, it fits best. Donna Adelson openly hated her former son-in-law, especially in the months leading up to his murder. She bombarded Dan with emails, one after another, cursing him, insulting him, using her entire arsenal of swear words. In one particularly telling message, she wrote that Wendy had suffered too long being married to Dan. His narcissism had destroyed their marriage, so now it was time to strike at the most painful spot. The entire Adelson family lived in Miami, but Wendy settled separately in Tallahassee, near her ex-husband. She wanted to return to Miami to be closer to her family, but Dan was against it. Since Markel did not resort to threats or violence, he went to court and obtained a ban on Wendy moving with the children. The fact is that during the divorce, they agreed on equal custody of their sons. But there was another reason for the mother-in-law's dislike of Dan. Shortly before his murder, he again went to court with a petition that did not allow Donna Adelson to spend time alone with his children without his supervision. Of course, this in no way justifies Donna's actions because, as we know, the attempt on Dan's life was planned long before this petition was filed. As you can see, at first glance, everything seems quite obvious, doesn't it? An angry mother-in-law, an offended ex-wife. Motive is always a key element in murder investigations, and although family conflicts often cause violence, one should not jump to hasty conclusions. Sometimes, deeper reasons and darker secrets are hidden behind outward simplicity. The task of a detective is to remain impartial and check all versions, even if they seem obvious. The offense went too far, but one should not jump to conclusions. Luis Rivera nearly ruined the entire case. While in jail without the right to bail on other charges, Luis asked for a meeting with investigators. He stated that he had information that he was ready to exchange for a deal with the investigation. The detectives readily agreed to re-interrogate Rivera, and this is where Luis gave his version of events. According to him, he did not know that a murder was being planned until he got into the car with Garcia. He was allegedly told that it would be an ordinary robbery, and when he found out about the murder of Dan Markel, he was extremely dissatisfied. He said he only wanted to rob the woman who was supposed to pay for it. Rivera and Garcia were promised $35,000 each for the job, but Luis insisted that he was not going to kill a man, especially a father of many children, with whom he was not previously acquainted and against whom he had nothing. Rivera claimed that he had never even heard this man's name before and had not seen him until Garcia showed him a photo. As for the Adelsons, Luis allegedly did not know about them at all, but only referred to a woman named Katie, that is, Catherine. It was she, according to Rivera, who was the main person in this case, and he also mentioned that some woman wanted to get her children back and gain full custody of them. Up to this point, the Adelsons still denied any involvement in the murder, despite the fact that the police had checks signed by Donna. However, this does not yet prove her intention to kill Dan. The checks could have been written for many reasons. But at this moment, the FBI joined the case. They developed a special operation to catch this family. Charlie Adelson began to receive strange calls from an unknown number. The caller was a woman who introduced herself as Sandy. She asked why Rivera, while in prison, was not worried about what was happening, and why his family was not helping him on the outside. Charlie was clearly frightened by these calls, but he kept his composure long enough not to give himself away. Sandy, of course, was an undercover agent, and the FBI was tapping Charlie's phone, hoping to hear something that could be used against him. But for now, this attempt failed. In July 2016, a grand jury in Leon County charged Garcia and Rivera with first-degree murder. Catherine Magbanua was arrested a little later. Rivera, who was already serving a sentence for other crimes, managed to have the charges reduced to second-degree murder, obviously for cooperating with the investigation and pleading guilty. He was sentenced to 12 years for unrelated crimes plus 19 years for complicity in the murder of Dan Markel. The trials of Catherine Magbanua and Sigfrido Garcia were combined into one, which took place on October 19, 2016, since the charges against them were identical. The prosecution claimed that Charlie Adelson was the mastermind behind this whole dirty business. Allegedly, he promised $100,000 for Dan's murder so that his sister could gain sole custody of the children after the death of her ex-husband. At the trial, the prosecutor called an interesting witness, Jeffrey Lacasse, who, as it turned out, had once dated Wendy Adelson. Lacasse confirmed that he had heard from Wendy about how her brother Charlie had repeatedly discussed the possibility of hiring a killer to murder Dan. According to Jeffrey, on July 13, Wendy asked if she could entrust him with something confidential. Eventually, she said that Charlie had considered all possible options for solving her problem and talked about hiring a hitman. Wendy told Lacasse that getting rid of Professor Markel would cost about $50,000. At the trial, Sigfrido Garcia insisted that the fatal shot was fired by his partner Luis Rivera. But the problem is that Rivera claimed just the opposite. However, this was hardly enough to remove the first-degree murder charge from Garcia. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus another 30 years for conspiracy. Garcia stated that he would appeal the verdict. As for Catherine, she categorically denied any involvement in the murder. At the same trial as Garcia, her charges were reduced to second-degree murder. But after 11 days of deliberation, the jury could not reach an agreement, so the judge was forced to declare a mistrial and order a new trial. Often during high-profile trials, unexpected twists occurred. Attempts by the accused to shift the blame onto each other. The appearance of new witnesses, conflicting testimonies, all this can significantly affect the course of the case. The task of the investigation and the prosecution is to carefully check each fact and not succumb to manipulation. Only in this way can a fair verdict be achieved. Catherine Magbanua was released on bail pending a new trial. It took over 6 years for Katie to finally face trial. The retrial began on May 16, 2022, and lasted 11 days. This time, the jury was more decisive. On May 27, 2022, Catherine Magbanua was found guilty of first-degree murder and solicitation to commit murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 30 years for participation in a criminal conspiracy and another 30 for solicitation. So even if Katie theoretically gets out of prison someday on a life sentence, she will still have to serve an additional 60 years behind bars. It is clear that the jurors were shocked by the details of this case. Many believe that two key figures, Wendy and Donna, were unfairly left at large, because of whom, most likely, everything happened. After all, it was they who planned and wished for Dan Markel's death. Well, we can only hope that justice will eventually catch up with them too. It is worth noting that this case and the verdicts handed down caused quite a stir in society. Opinions were divided. Some consider the punishment too lenient, while others consider it too severe. This country, with a population of over 200 million people, has always impressed with its contrasts and diversity. But now we will focus on the metropolis of Sao Paulo, the economic heart of the state. Among the numerous wealthy families of this city, the von Richthofen family stood out. Their estate, located in the prestigious Brooklyn district, was valued at around some $3 million Brazilian dollars. Imagine this: luxurious living rooms, cozy bedrooms, a huge swimming pool, a spacious office, and even a private library. All of this was hidden behind a high brick wall, surrounded by exotic plants. The entrance to the mansion was guarded by massive gates, as if emphasizing the status and privacy of the owners' lives. You know, when my colleagues told me about this family, I immediately understood that behind the external glamour and luxury, there could be something more. After all, as the saying goes, the wealthier the family, the more reasons for envy and ill intentions from others. And unfortunately, as subsequent events showed, this assumption turned out to be true. The house itself was surrounded by a high fence that securely protected the residents from prying eyes. However, the staff and guests had to pass through massive gates, which likely symbolized the strength and steadfastness of this family in the eyes of society. At least, that's how it might have seemed at first glance. Allow me to introduce you to the head of the von Richthofen family, Manfred, a brilliant German engineer. This man held the position of director in a large company responsible for the operation of highways and roads leading to Sao Paulo. His wife, Mauricia, was a native Brazilian and worked as a local psychiatrist. The story of their meeting is quite romantic. Monford was studying civil engineering at the University of Sao Paulo at the time, and it was there that his eyes first met Mauricia's. As they themselves told, it was love at first sight. The friendly and sociable Mauricia perfectly complemented the calm and gentle Monford. It seemed like fate had brought them together. Later, they got married and started dreaming of children, and so in 1983, their firstborn daughter, named Susan, was born. 4 years later, her younger brother Andres was born. Both children grew up in a wealthy family and attended the most prestigious private schools in Sao Paulo. Describing Susan, she was a rather quiet and shy girl. Although she was not a leader among her peers, she had a few close friends. Susan was always an obedient daughter and had a warm relationship with her brother. Additionally, the girl showed remarkable abilities in languages and later mastered 3 foreign languages. After graduating from a German high school, she decided to continue her studies at the law faculty of the University of Sao Paulo. In my opinion, if Susan had succeeded in the legal field, perhaps her life would have turned out differently. Despite her aspirations for a successful career, the girl never had a need for money. And there was a simple reason for this: her parents were extremely wealthy people. According to my information, the wealth of the von Richthofen family was estimated at approximately $17 million. And according to unverified information, Monford had around 10 million euros in a Swiss bank account, which he planned to pass on to Susan after her studies. So essentially, the girl only had to be an obedient daughter and wait for her inheritance. However, as the year 2002 approached, cracks began to appear in the relationship between the parents and Susan. The girl had just reached adulthood and, as often happens, was more interested in love than finances. I will now share all the details with you. It seemed like the girl had everything: a carefree childhood, brilliant education, and a guaranteed $1 million inheritance. But did this bring her happiness? As subsequent events showed, probably not. By the year 2002, the relationship between Susan and her parents began to deteriorate. The thing was, Susan turned 18, and like most of her peers, she became more interested in love than finances. But let's go back a bit to 1999. At that time, the von Richthofen family visited an airplane model exhibition. Susan's younger brother Andreas showed a keen interest in this hobby. It was there that he met 19-year-old Daniel Kravinhos, who already had experience in creating flying models. Intrigued, Andreas even asked his parents to pay for modeling lessons with Daniel, and they agreed, not suspecting the consequences it would lead to. While the boys enthusiastically engaged in building airplanes, Daniel unexpectedly caught the attention of Andreas' older sister, Susan. At first glance, Daniel and Susan seemed like complete opposites. He, a boy from a poor and troubled family, who was even expelled from college for poor performance. She, a well-bred girl from an aristocratic family who had received a brilliant education. However, despite all the differences, a real passion flared up between them. Susan was intrigued by Daniel's rebellious nature. He was to her the embodiment of freedom and new exciting emotions. And although the girl understood that her parents would likely not approve of such a choice, she could not resist his charms. So Susan began to secretly meet with Daniel. She did not yet know the tragic consequences this decision would lead to. For a while, this cunning plan worked. The parents were not thrilled about Daniel's visits, but still allowed him to come, considering him Andreas' regular friend. However, as it is known, lies eventually come to light, and one day, Monford and Mauricia finally learned the truth about Daniel, that he was not studying anywhere, regularly used prohibited substances, and abused alcohol. Of course, such a discovery could not please them. As an experienced detective, I understand well the parents' desire to protect their child. Monford and Mauricia spared no effort to ensure a better future for Susan, and now all their efforts could go to waste because of some garage mechanic. But the lovers were not ready to give up. Unexpectedly, Susan's younger brother Andreas stood by their side. The boy adored his sister sincerely and considered Daniel his best friend, so he decided to help the two of them by hiding their secret meetings from their parents. While Susan and Daniel enjoyed their forbidden encounters, Andreas came up with plausible stories for the parents, covering for his sister. But how long would he be able to lead everyone by the nose? And what consequences would this deceit lead to? While Susan and Daniel's romance was gaining momentum, Susan's younger brother Andreas became their true guardian angel. He sincerely admired Daniel's rebellious spirit and adored his sister, so he actively facilitated their meetings. While the lovers were hanging out at the auto shop or spending time at Daniel's home, Andreas skillfully covered for them in front of their parents. The boy came up with ingenious excuses to justify Susan's long absences and divert parental suspicions, but fate gave the couple a chance to be together for a whole month. Montfort and Mauritia set off on a long vacation to Europe, leaving the children in charge of the estate. Susan, who had already turned 18 at that time, saw this as a great opportunity to prove her maturity and independence to her parents. However, Susan decided differently. Instead of taking responsibility for the house, she secretly invited Daniel to stay at the mansion. And so the lovers spent a whole month enjoying life by the pool, generously pouring alcohol into their glasses and indulging in ecstasy like seeds. From a detective's perspective, I can assume that these two clearly decided to make up for lost time. After all, they had been forced to hide in corners and strangers' garages until now. And here they were, a luxurious empty house at their disposal. But as it is known, everything in life comes at a price. Upon their return from vacation, the parents learned how Susan had spent her time in their absence. And thus, real battles began in the von Richthofen family. The scandals and arguments did not cease for weeks. The parents tried to reason with their daughter, but she demonstratively ignored all their advice. Furthermore, Susan became even more stubborn in her intention to be with Daniel. As the culmination of this confrontation, the girl presented her parents with a bold ultimatum. She demanded that Montfort buy her and her lover an apartment where they could live peacefully and happily. Of course, the family patriarch categorically refused. Montfort stated that Susan could do whatever she pleased, but at her own expense. And for added emphasis, he threatened to cut off the defiant daughter from financial support. This decision infuriated the girl to the point of fainting. She ranted and stomped her feet uncontrollably, but eventually had to give in. At least she pretended to, because in reality, Susan had no intention of giving up. She continued to secretly meet with Daniel. Moreover, the two of them began to hatch some sinister plan. A plan that later shocked all of Brazil and even made seasoned police officers shudder. Attention, I ask you to prepare yourself seriously, as what I am about to tell you is capable of shocking even the most resilient. So on November 1, 22, something horrifying happened at the von Richthofen family estate. Early in the morning, residents of the prestigious Brooklyn district woke up to desperate screams coming from the house. Some frantic screams of horror that sent chills down their spines. As later revealed, it was the children, Susan and Andreas, screaming in despair when they saw a gruesome scene in their parents' bedroom. The previous evening, both teenagers had slipped out of the house for their own errands, and when they returned around 4 in the morning, they had no idea of the horror awaiting them inside. Upon entering the mansion, they ran upstairs to the main bedroom, hoping to greet their parents. But instead of Montfort and Mauritia's smiling faces, they were met with a gruesome sight. The bloody bodies of the couple lay on the bed in unnatural poses. It was clear at first glance they had been brutally murdered in their sleep. This was evidenced by the rumpled bed and scattered belongings. Judging from the chaos in the room, the unfortunate couple had woken up, but had not even had a chance to resist. It seemed like the attackers burst in and immediately began to torment them. When the police officers arrived at the crime scene, they were faced with a horrifying sight. Montfort and Mauritia were beaten beyond recognition. Their faces turned into complete bloody masks, their bodies covered in numerous wounds, and prominent red marks of strangulation were visible on the victims' necks. What was particularly striking was that Mauritia's head was covered with a plastic garbage bag. Even hardened police officers had to shake themselves to start examining the bodies. Although it initially seemed like burglars had broken into the house, something didn't add up in this version. Yes, the criminals took cash from a suitcase and other hidden places. But was it necessary to be so cruel to the victims for the sake of money? Moreover, expensive items and electronics remained undamaged. Upon inspecting the office and living rooms, the cops came across a series of highly suspicious details. The first thing that caught their eye was the deactivated alarm system. Although the security guards were nearby, they were somehow not notified of the intrusion. Upon closer examination, it became clear. Someone entered the code and deliberately turned off the security system. Furthermore, the ransacked scene seemed somewhat peculiar. Documents and papers, although scattered around the office, were surprisingly evenly distributed. Not at all as it should be after a chaotic search by burglars. Everything indicated an attempt to stage a robbery. Another alarming detail, the doors and windows were left undamaged, meaning the criminals either had keys or someone let them in from the inside. And some rooms were completely bypassed by the criminals as if they knew there was nothing valuable there. While the police tried to unravel this tangle of mysterious circumstances, the public began to build the most incredible assumptions. The media, of course, immediately leaned towards the most obvious suspects, the children of the murdered couple, Susan and Andreas. Reporters portrayed Andreas as a grief-stricken son barely holding it together, on the verge of losing his mind from the loss of his parents. The boy was so deeply affected by the tragedy that he would start gasping for breath from tears during interviews with journalists. In contrast, Susan's behavior raised many questions in society. Unlike her brother, the girl remained remarkably restrained and aloof. There were no signs of despair or suffering, as if she was talking about distant relatives, not her own parents. Of course, everyone grieves in their own way, but Susan's excessive calmness raised certain suspicions. During witness interviews, investigators learned interesting details about how the siblings spent the evening before the murder. It turns out that on October 31 at 9 p.m., Susan took 15-year-old Andreas out of the house, supposedly to a party at an internet cafe. And all this without the knowledge of the parents, who thought their son had long been asleep in bed. Instead of staying with her brother, Susan dropped him off at the entertainment venue and went off in an unknown direction herself. As later revealed, the girl booked a hotel room nearby to be alone. Why did she do this? Perhaps to secure an alibi for herself. These questions kept law enforcement officers on edge. But the most alarming detail was yet to come. Before checking into the hotel, Susan called her boyfriend, Daniel. She informed him that they could meet and hang out together. This raised reasonable suspicions, with the lovers planning to have a party. But the strangeness did not end there. Around 4 a.m, Susan and Andreas secretly returned home and found their parents dead. So the children went for a walk, and when they returned, Montfort and Mauritia had already been killed. Wasn't this too much of a coincidence? Moreover, the conflicting testimonies of Susan and Andreas added more confusion to the case. While the boy claimed that the parents were strongly against his sister's relationship with Daniel, Susan insisted that Montfort and Mauritia had no issues with her choice of partner. And this, as we remember, was a blatant lie. So the first warning bells rang at this stage of the investigation. Susan's strange behavior, both before and after the murder, cast suspicion on her and her boyfriend. However, the evidence gathered was insufficient to formally accuse them. On November 1, 2002, the von Richthofen couple was laid to rest. Relatives, colleagues of the deceased, and numerous media representatives gathered for the farewell ceremony. Journalists were intrigued by a peculiar detail. While Andreas cried uncontrollably, Susan hardly shed a tear for her parents. Such indifference seemed suspicious even to the average person. Soon, shocking rumors began to spread throughout the town. It was rumored that just 3 days after her parents' death, heartless Susan threw a loud poolside party at her estate. Allegedly, a crowd of young people gathered there, music blared throughout the neighborhood, and the hostess laughed carelessly, as if there was no sorrow. Of course, investigators could not rely solely on gossip. However, information about Susan's strange behavior came from several independent sources. But what troubled detectives the most was an anonymous tip. A mysterious informant told the police about a suspicious purchase made by Daniel's brother, Christian Cotes. The purchase of a Suzuki motorcycle itself did not seem unusual. However, Christian bought this vehicle at a local dealership just a few days after Montfort and Mauritia's murder. At that time, Christian was 26 years old. He paid for the motorcycle in cash with large bills, which automatically raised suspicion. Those who knew the Cotes brothers closely unanimously claimed that neither Daniel nor Christian had a steady job or stable income. These guys were regulars at local bars and constantly used prohibited substances. So where did Christian suddenly get such a sum of money? This tip became a kind of final straw for law enforcement. Gathering all available information, the cops began to lean towards the idea that the solution should be sought among the victim's closest circle, among family and acquaintances. And above all, they were interested in Susan and Daniel, whose behavior raised the most questions. Of course, all these coincidences and strange facts could not yet be considered direct evidence. Something more substantial was needed to bring formal charges. So the police decided to focus all their efforts on digging into the young couple and their friends. And very soon, this approach yielded unexpected results. It was the information about the suspicious motorcycle purchase that became the key to unraveling this tangled case. Armed with this lead, the cops immediately summoned Christian Cotes, Daniel's brother, for questioning. This young man behaved extremely boldly. He pretended to be a tough guy who knew nothing about the murder. But when the investigators pressed him hard and presented the evidence, Christian finally cracked. What he revealed shocked even seasoned detectives. It turned out that the brutal murder of the von Richthofen couple was orchestrated by none other than Daniel and Susan. According to Christian, this couple planned the murder of the girl's parents, And all this was to finally live together and not depend on anyone. And perhaps the main motive was the $17 million that Susan was supposed to inherit after Monfred and Morris's death. Armed with this information, my colleagues immediately arrested the lovers and began interrogating them. And here is where the most interesting part began. Even with fresh handcuff marks on their wrists, Susan and Daniel managed to accuse each other. The girl insisted that money was not the main motive for her. She claimed that she agreed to the murder under pressure from Daniel. But the boy immediately denied this version. According to him, the prospect of getting rich played a decisive role in Susan agreeing to the crime. And most strangely, as soon as they found themselves behind bars, these two suddenly broke off their relationship. It was as if there were no intense feelings or shared dreams of a carefree life. Did the millions cloud their judgment and kill all humanity in them? But let's return to the court case. Despite undeniable evidence of guilt, an exception was made for Susan. She was released on bail until the trial, which began almost 4 years after the crime. And during this time, she clearly did not mourn her parents. Using the services of top lawyers, Susan almost took control of the entire inheritance. At the same time, she gave interviews to local media, where she cried in her vest and accused Daniel of all sins. She claimed that he ruined her family and life. On screen, Susan appeared as a distraught and broken girl, a true victim of circumstances. But in my opinion, all this theatrics was just an attempt to whitewash her reputation. And honestly, she didn't succeed very well. Her tears sounded too fake, and her suffering seemed too staged. So when on July 17, 2006, the courtroom was filled, all the cards were laid out. The jury was presented with a detailed chronology of events on that fateful Halloween night, and what they heard took even the most resilient by surprise. It turns out that while Morrisha and Monfred were peacefully asleep, unaware of the impending danger, Susan cunningly led her younger brother out of the house. Andreas was convinced that his sister just wanted to take him to a party at an internet cafe. The poor boy had no idea of the true purpose behind Susan's outing. After dropping her brother off at the party venue, Susan returned home in a car with her accomplices Daniel and Christian. Although the security guard noticed her return, he had no idea that something terrible was about to happen. First, Susan visited her parents' bedroom supposedly to check if Morrisha and Monfred were sound asleep. Once she confirmed all was quiet, she deactivated the alarm system, allowing the nighttime guests to enter. Then the criminal trio calmly positioned themselves in the living room. They put on gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, pulled their hoods over their heads, and armed themselves with iron bars. Meanwhile, Susan settled on the couch in front of the TV. Of course, how could she miss her favorite show, even during the murder of her parents? And then Daniel and Christian burst into the couple's bedroom and began assaulting them with the bars. Monfred and Morrisha fought desperately for their lives, but the resistance proved futile against the two young, strong men. Seeking to end the bloody ordeal quickly, the brothers grabbed knives and finished off the unfortunate victims. While Monfred died immediately, Morrisha turned out to be more resilient. She was still breathing, though it seemed like life was barely flickering in her battered body. Then Daniel committed an unprecedented act of cruelty. He placed a plastic bag over Morrisha's head and tightened it with all his might, cutting off her air supply. Within minutes, the woman suffocated. After completing their dark deed, the three killers proceeded to stage a robbery to cover their tracks. They pocketed the money, scattered documents in the office, and left. Each went their separate ways to create alibis. Christian went to grab a bite at the nearest fast food joint. Daniel and Susan pretended to be a couple in a hotel room and even requested a receipt as proof of their presence. But Susan's behavior was the most cynical. Acting as if nothing had happened, she picked up her brother from the party, brought him home, and started wailing over the bodies of her slain parents. What an acting talent! During the trial, each tried to portray themselves as victims. Susan blamed Daniel, mentioning some mysterious substances he allegedly constantly gave her to manipulate her. On the other hand, the Kravinhos brothers claimed they acted under the influence of the girl. They argued that she orchestrated everything, and they were just protecting their unfortunate friend from abusive alcoholic parents. However, the forensic examination quickly dispelled these myths. There was no trace of alcohol in the victim's blood. Gradually, a coherent picture began to form in the minds of the jurors, and it was grim news for the defendants. Prosecutor Roberta Treadley portrayed Susan as the mastermind, the ideological inspiration behind the crime. In her speeches, the girl was depicted as a cunning enchantress driven by a thirst for money and power. According to the prosecution, Susan was ready to go as far as stepping over her parents' bodies to finally achieve the freedom and wealth she desired. So on July 22, 2006, after 5 days of legal battles, the trio of killers was found guilty. Prosecutors pushed for a 50-year prison term, but unfortunately, such a severe punishment was not handed down to the criminals. Susan and Daniel were sentenced to 40 years behind bars, while Christian received a lighter sentence of 38 years as an accomplice. However, Susan has tried multiple times to appeal the court's decision. She claimed that mental disorders pushed her to commit the crime, or that she was not in her right mind. Of course, all these excuses were dismissed, but her charisma did work its magic. Currently, Susan and Daniel are serving their sentences in a semi-open regime. This means they can go home for holidays and even take vacations, something usually not allowed for murderers. While Susan serves her conditional sentence, the von Richthofen family home was long sold to unknown buyers. Andreas was left without a roof over his head, without close relatives. And while his sister enjoys her semi-early release, he wanders the world like a ghost. And the worst part is that after Susan's release, she will calmly inherit her parents' fortune. The same $17 million for which she committed murder. While her brother suffers in a shelter, the sister will once again lead a luxurious life. By the time her 40-year sentence ends in 2042, Susan will walk free, rich, and unrestricted, and time will erase all traces of past crimes. Christina Shawn was born in September 1976 in the American city of New Orleans. Her parents dedicated their lives to military service, so the family often had to relocate, moving from one military base to another, both within the country and abroad. These constant changes of environment allowed the girl to learn about the world from a young age, meet new people and their cultures, and develop communication skills. At the same time, the need to constantly adapt to new living conditions inevitably caused stress. However, Christina seemed to overcome any difficulties with ease, only tempering her character. Eventually, the family settled in the town of Biloxi, Mississippi. It was here, at a more conscious age, that Christina discovered her love for the culinary arts. The teenage girl enjoyed cooking, and it became her way of supporting her parents, who, due to their busy work schedules, did not always have the opportunity to prepare food themselves. Christina eagerly studied cooking magazines and newspapers, mastering the secrets of the craft, and later even began to create her own unique dishes. However, cooking was not the girl's only passion. After graduating from high school, on the advice of her parents, she decided to continue her education and moved to Los Angeles, where she enrolled in the Academy of Dramatic Arts. During her studies, which ended in 2000, Christina repeatedly participated in theatrical productions and even managed to star in episodic roles in Hollywood films, in particular, as a stuntwoman in the movie Terminator, Genesis. Christina stood out not only for her beauty, but also for her athletic physique, sociability, self-confidence, and diverse talents. She easily found common ground with others and knew how to present herself in the best light. In her free time, the girl preferred active outdoor recreation. Over time, this hobby grew into something more. Christina realized what she wanted to do in life. Thanks to her dedication to a healthy lifestyle, she decided to devote herself to helping other people, motivating them to follow proper nutrition and engage in fitness. Christina herself served as a living example that such an approach is the key to a harmonious life. The girl actively promoted the rejection of bad habits. It was these interests which completely captivated Christina in adulthood that prompted her to dream of her own catering company. She planned to organize catering at themed events and parties, offering guests healthy and delicious dishes, a format typical for the early 2000s. In 2005, Christina officially registered her business and enthusiastically immersed herself in work. Through her business, she actively popularized the ideas of using environmentally friendly products and materials, positioning her own brand as completely natural and beneficial. Christy had even more ambitious plans. Another of her cherished dreams was to create a self-sufficient farm that could provide people with food with minimal interference in natural processes. The girl devoted many years to developing these ideas while continuing to pursue her other favorite activities. In 2012, Christy became a finalist in the 8th season of a popular television cooking show, but she failed to win. She usually accepted defeat with dignity, but this time she felt that she had been treated unfairly. In her opinion, the jury misunderstood and misjudged her original approach to cooking, which caused her strong indignation. However, Christy was not going to give up and was determined to prove to everyone that she was capable of pursuing her goal despite the obstacles. Later, the unpleasant impressions from this incident faded, and Christy threw herself into her usual affairs with renewed vigor. She continued to develop her catering business while participating in the filming of other culinary television programs. It was on one of these projects that fate brought her together with Zeb Quinn, who was engaged in casting actors and participants for various shows. The man fell in love with the charming blonde at first sight. At first, a friendly relationship developed between them, which gradually grew into a mutual romantic attraction. Joseph fully supported Christy and believed in the great prospects of her ideas and aspirations. Later, the couple decided to start a new life together and fulfill their dream of having their own farm. They left California, sold the catering company, and moved to the cozy town of Lester in North Carolina, with a population of just under 12,000 people. At that time, the couple was already planning to start a family, so they took care to purchase a spacious plot of land. They became the owners of 36 acres, which was ideal for building the farm of their dreams and fulfilling their plans for the future, including having children. In September 2014, the couple officially formalized their relationship by exchanging wedding vows at the local community center, surrounded by their closest friends and family. Despite the move, Joseph continued to work remotely in television. From the outside, the Cote couple seemed like the perfect match, both bright, ambitious, and harmoniously complementing each other. Thanks to their talents, they had grand plans for the future. At the beginning of 2015, their lives changed dramatically. Christy became pregnant, and the couple eagerly awaited the birth of their firstborn, a girl they decided to name Skylar. It seemed that everything in their life was going as well as possible. The young family was actively preparing for the new addition, as Christy's pregnancy had already reached the 5th month. However, this story will not have a happy ending. The idyll lasted only until March 2015, when worried relatives suddenly found it impossible to contact either 38-year-old Christy or 45-year-old Joseph by phone. The calendar showed March 15, 2015, when the alarmed relatives of Joseph and Christy had been trying in vain to reach the couple by phone for several days in a row. All their attempts to contact them by phone proved futile. Since the relatives lived a considerable distance from the couple's home, they were unable to visit in person and check if everything was all right with the young family. So they turned to Cecilia, a close friend of Christy's who lived nearby, for help. The girl agreed to visit the couple's house to find out the reasons for their silence. Upon arriving at the scene, Cecilia was alarmed by the oppressive silence that reigned around. Joseph and Christy's cars were parked in the yard, but the owners themselves did not respond to knocking on the door or loud calls. Looking through the windows, her friend could not see any signs of the presence of either the husband or the wife. There was an eerie impression that they had simply vanished into thin air. The situation seemed extremely strange because their beloved dogs remained inside the house. Christy treated her pets like children and would never leave them unattended under any circumstances. Even in the case of short-term trips on business, she always made sure to arrange for someone to take care of the animals. However, this time, what was happening did not fit at all with the usual way of life of the young couple. According to their plans, Christy had no scheduled trips for that date. At 5 months pregnant, the woman led a predominantly domestic lifestyle and rarely left the confines of her own home. After carefully examining the house, Cecilia noticed signs of a break-in on the back door, which she immediately reported to the relatives of the missing couple. After that, Christy's parents did not hesitate to file a missing persons report with the police regarding their daughter and son-in-law. When the patrol officers arrived on the call, they found the doors open and made sure that no one was inside. The law enforcement officers suspected that the couple might have been victims of abduction, so the house was immediately sealed off to preserve potential evidence. In order to get at least some clue, the detectives made a request to the mobile operator regarding incoming and outgoing calls from the missing couple's phones. It turned out that in recent days, Joseph and Christy had not made any calls, which only confirmed the worst fears of their loved ones. The last recorded calls were dated March 10 and 11, and none of them aroused suspicion. The couple communicated exclusively with friends and relatives. A thorough inspection of the scene revealed traces in the house that indicated an intrusion and probable abduction of the owners. Some valuables had disappeared, but no significant clues were found that would shed light on the identity of the perpetrator. Unfortunately, the criminal did not leave behind any fingerprints or biological traces. The investigation, having barely begun, was already reaching a dead end. The news of this event shook the small community of the town. Neighbors began actively discussing among themselves possible versions of what could have happened to the successful and attractive couple. Some of them recalled how on March 13 they saw a stranger throwing an extremely bulky and heavy-looking black bag into a garbage container near the house of the missing couple. after which he quickly walked away. Unfortunately, the garbage from the bins was soon taken out, so it was no longer possible to examine the contents of the mysterious bag. The identity of the man who disposed of the garbage bag was quickly established. He turned out to be 36-year-old Robert Owens, who lived near the Cote couple's home and worked various odd jobs, including in the yard of the missing couple. In addition, he was a close friend of Christy and Joseph, often communicated with them, and was even a guest at their wedding. This information attracted the close attention of the investigators, and on March 16, Robert was called in for questioning. However, at the police station, he firmly denied any involvement in the disappearance of his friends. Meanwhile, while the suspect was being interrogated, the police managed to find the same garbage bag that the man had thrown away near the house of the missing couple. Its contents turned out to be quite telling: charred fragments of things, some of which resembled the remains of Christy and Joseph's clothes. The find only heightened the detective's suspicions about Robert's possible involvement in the crime. When the investigators informed Robert about the discovery of the garbage bag, he instantly became confused and began to get tangled up in his own testimony. Eventually, under the pressure of the evidence, the man confessed to the crime. According to him, on March 12, 2015, he was heading to Joseph's house, intending to perform some work. But on the way, his car ended up in a ditch near the couple's house. Robert walked the rest of the way and asked his friends to help pull out his pickup truck. Christy and Joseph readily agreed, and together they all headed to the scene of the incident. While the owners were pushing the car from the outside, their friend tried to start the engine and move from the spot. However, as Robert confessed, at some point, the unforeseeable happened. He accidentally ran over the couple. By pressing the gas pedal, the man hit Christy and Joseph, causing them to fall and lose consciousness. In a panic, Robert accidentally pressed the gas again, running over his friends' bodies a second time. The suspect insisted that it was an accident, but at that moment, he was afraid that he would not be believed and would inevitably be accused of intentional murder. In the end, Robert made the fatal decision not to call the police or an ambulance. Christy and Joseph were lying motionless and showing no signs of life, but instead of trying to help them, the man decided to get rid of the bodies and destroy all traces of the crime. He loaded the lifeless bodies of his friends into his pickup truck and took them to his own home. There, in the bathroom, Robert mutilated Joseph's body with an electric saw. He put the man's body parts in plastic bags and temporarily left Christy's body in the bedroom before doing the same to her. After that, the killer tried to destroy the remains as much as possible by burning the body fragments in the stove located in his kitchen. Robert committed all these horrific actions in order to conceal the traces of the brutal crime. After listening to the chilling details of the confession, the detectives immediately went to the suspect's house with a search warrant. There, in the stove, they found severely burnt bone fragments belonging to Christy and Joseph. Robert had not managed to completely get rid of the terrible evidence. In addition, traces of blood and biological material of the deceased couple were found on the electric saw, in the bathroom, bedroom, and on the kitchen stove. All these findings fully confirmed the truthfulness of Robert's confession regarding the dismemberment of the bodies. Without wasting time, that same night, the suspect was arrested. He was charged with the intentional murder of 2 people, as well as the unborn child, unlawful entry, and burglary. Robert did not deny his guilt in the crimes committed, but when the investigators asked him why he did not immediately report the incident to the police if it was an accident, he could not answer. His story seemed extremely unconvincing and raised reasonable doubts. The detectives did not believe the version about the accidental running over of the couple and suspected that Robert was trying to hide something. This prompted them to study the personality of the detainee more thoroughly. In the course of further investigation, law enforcement officers managed to establish Robert's probable involvement in another crime committed 15 years ago, when his close friend disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Delving into the suspect's past, the police stumbled upon another chilling secret of brutal murder with a similar modus operandi. Zeb Quinn, Robert's friend, was born in 1981. It seemed that this young man had a brilliant future ahead of him. While still in school, he enrolled in military training courses and planned to join the United States Air Force immediately after graduation. Zeb was characterized as a caring and friendly guy. At the time of his disappearance, he was working at a local Walmart supermarket. Zeb lived in the city of Asheville, North Carolina, where he met Robert Owens, the future killer of the Cote couple. One January evening in 2000, Zeb finished his work shift at 9 p.m. He was going to go on a short trip with his friend Robert so that he could buy a new car. However, Zeb did not return home that night. His mother had an uneasy feeling that something was wrong. The woman had good reason to believe that her son did not plan to leave home for long. After all, Zeb did not take with him his wallet with money, a change of clothes, or the solution for his contact lenses, which he could not do without. Everything indicated that he intended to return as soon as possible. However, neither the next morning nor even a day later, Zeb still did not return home. The alarmed mother of the young man turned to the police with a statement about her son's disappearance. But despite all the efforts of law enforcement officers, it was not possible to find any useful information about his whereabouts. The detectives carefully studied the surveillance camera recordings that could have captured the movements of the missing person on the day of his disappearance. However, Zeb was last seen on video only at 9:15 p.m. when he entered a small store with a stranger to buy a soft drink. Later, this mysterious companion was recognized as Robert Owens, the very person with whom Zeb went on that fateful trip. Surveillance cameras recorded Zeb getting into his light blue Mazda, while Robert settled behind the wheel of a Ford pickup truck. The cars left the parking lot one after the other, after which the young man's trail broke off. He seemed to have vanished into thin air. Naturally, the investigators had a number of questions for Robert, as he was the last one who communicated with the missing person and probably could shed light on his subsequent fate. During a conversation with detectives, Robert tried to recreate the events that took place after the cars disappeared from the camera's field of view. According to him, shortly after leaving the store, he and Zeb parted ways because Robert received a short message on his pager with a job offer. In order to discuss the potential order in more detail, the man was forced to leave for a while and find the nearest payphone, so he gave Zeb a conventional signal with his headlights, and both cars stopped on the side of the road. Robert explained the situation to his friend and asked him to wait a bit while he settled all the issues, after which he went about his business. As Robert claimed, he dealt with his affairs quite quickly, in about 10 minutes, and was already going to return to the place where he had left his friend. However, according to his own confession, it was not that simple. The man said that during that period, he was suffering from depression and was taking medications prescribed by a doctor, which sometimes caused him to have a depressed state and a somewhat distorted perception of reality. It seems that this is exactly what happened that fatal evening. Robert described his condition at that time as extremely agitated and confused, as if he was completely losing control of himself. According to the suspect's version, when he was approaching the agreed meeting place, he lost control of the vehicle and his pickup truck flew into a ditch. Despite all his attempts, Robert could not pull the car out on his own. However, realizing that he was near the place where Zeb was waiting for him, the man decided to walk the rest of the way. Trying once again to cope with the blocked vehicle, Robert suddenly noticed that a car very similar to his 18-year-old friend's car drove past him, but the driver did not stop or even slow down. Robert had no way to catch up with or pursue the car without his own vehicle. Thus, according to the suspect, he had no idea where Zeb could have gone and what had happened to him. The subsequent chronology of events in Robert's account seemed extremely vague and confused. It is only known that on the same night, he ended up in the hospital, allegedly due to an accident, which, however, was in no way connected with Zeb's disappearance at least. This is the version voiced by the man. However, no confirmation of his words could be found according to police reports. No accidents were recorded in the county that night. Robert claimed that as a result of the accident, he received quite serious injuries, broken ribs and a concussion. According to him, he sustained these injuries a few hours after Zeb's disappearance. The suspect's story revealed many gaps and inconsistencies, which gave the impression that he was simply making up details on the fly to confuse the police. Soon, Robert was recognized as the main suspect in this case, as he had no convincing alibi and was the last person who had contact with the missing young man. However, the investigators did not immediately manage to break Robert during interrogations to bring charges. They needed more substantial evidence than just suspicions. Therefore, a primary task was to find either the missing boy or at least his car. It is worth noting that in the early 2000s, the investigation of such crimes was much more difficult than it is today. Law enforcement officers did not have the technical capabilities to quickly establish the whereabouts of a suspect or victim or track their telephone conversations. Instant messaging services were also just beginning to gain popularity and were not under the supervision of special services. There were also very few street surveillance cameras. In fact, all hope was placed on random witnesses who could provide any information about the events of that evening. But unfortunately, none could be found. Later, new persons of interest were added to the list of suspects, among them Massey Taylor and her ex-boyfriend. As it turned out, Massey had started dating Zeb shortly before his mysterious disappearance. 2 weeks before these events, the young people accidentally met in one of the local restaurants and had been communicating ever since. At that time, the girl had just broken up with her previous boyfriend, Wesley Smith. Rumor had it that their relationship was not without manifestations of physical and psychological violence on the part of the ex-partner. According to witnesses, Zeb, having learned about Massey's problems with her former partner, expressed a desire to intervene and help the girl. One day, he even showed up at her work just at the moment when Wesley was there. The young man intended to personally talk to the offender of his new friend, as she was clearly not indifferent to him. A heated argument broke out between Zeb and Wesley, which nearly turned into a fight. Several eyewitnesses heard Massey's enraged ex-boyfriend openly threaten to settle scores with his rival. It was quite obvious that he had a motive to get rid of Zeb. However, during interrogations at the police station, both Massey and Wesley firmly denied any involvement in Zeb's disappearance. The alibis of both were thoroughly checked, and eventually, the investigation concluded that they were not involved in this case. Therefore, the investigation and search for the missing boy continued. 4 days after his disappearance, Zeb's abandoned light blue Mazda was found. One of the employees who worked with the boy's mother called her and reported that he had seen the familiar car in a parking lot near the hospital. The car had obviously been abandoned under strange circumstances. The headlights were still on, and the doors were unlocked. After carefully examining the interior of the car, police experts were able to find several personal belongings of the missing owner, including a plastic card for using payphones. Also found in the car were several empty drink bottles and an unknown man's jacket, which definitely did not belong to Zeb. It was not possible to establish who owned this item of clothing, which was lying on the back seat. Interestingly, an inscription made with women's lipstick was found on the windshield of the car. The detectives made every effort to analyze the collected evidence, but this did not yield the desired results. It was impossible to track where and when Zeb's phone card was last used. Experts could not find traces of DNA or fingerprints on any of the items found in the car that would belong to anyone other than the vehicle's owner. The police managed to find several witnesses who claimed to have seen a young girl behind the wheel of the Mazda. Judging by their descriptions, she looked very much like Massey Taylor, Zeb's girlfriend. However, it was not possible to prove her involvement in the events of that night, as Massey had a reliable alibi. Despite all the difficulties, one rather interesting fact did come to light during the investigation. Shortly before his disappearance, Zeb sent a mysterious message to his aunt's pager. Unfortunately, the woman was unable to view it right away, as she had just gone to dinner at the home of Massey's mother, with whom she was friends. This unfortunate coincidence prevented her from finding out what her nephew was trying to convey in the last hours before his disappearance. Returning late in the evening from her friend's house, Zeb's aunt discovered that her home had been robbed. The intruders had taken away many valuable items, including the same pager with the unknown message from her nephew. Therefore, the woman could no longer find out what the text contained. It is noteworthy that the police experts who worked at the crime scene could not find any fingerprints or even any clue that would indicate the identity of the burglar. It is quite possible that the thief acted in gloves, leaving no traces. Thus, the investigation reached a dead end, and no substantial information about Zeb's fate could be obtained. The case remained unsolved, and the young man was considered missing for a long 15 years. However, the investigators were convinced that it was Robert who was involved in his disappearance and most likely killed his friend. The situation changed radically only in 2015, when Robert was arrested on charges of murdering the married couple. During a thorough search of his home, police stumbled upon a strange find. Under a thick layer of concrete, they discovered a cavity containing solid fragments of organic origin, as well as particles of fabric and skin. Such a method of getting rid of physical evidence seemed extremely suspicious. The detectives instantly realized that these findings could shed light on the mystery of Zeb's disappearance, as it was quite likely that the discovered remains could belong to him. All the physical evidence was removed from the suspect's home and sent for examination. In addition to the mysterious bones, several other items were found that attracted the attention of investigators, in particular, a plastic bag with a white powder of unknown origin. Later, an examination showed that the substance was quicklime. Important testimony was also obtained from one of the detainees' relatives. He recalled that in the winter of 2000 or a little later, Robert was burning some garbage on his property, which emitted an extremely pungent and unpleasant odor that even then seemed extremely strange to the witness. Soon after, a concrete platform appeared in the same place, which did not fit into the overall landscape of the yard at all. When asked by neighbors, the owner replied that he planned to arrange a pond for fish farming, but this idea was never realized, and later it was completely forgotten. However, it is worth noting that it was under this platform that the police discovered the aforementioned cavity with the mysterious bones. The results of the forensic examination confirmed the worst fears of the investigation. The remains did indeed belong to Zeb Quinn, who had disappeared 15 years earlier. The case of the young man's murder was moved from a dead point, and on April 27, 2017, Robert Owens appeared in court on charges of committing this and other serious crimes. The defense of the defendant immediately began active attempts to justify the actions of their client and mitigate his guilt. The lawyers argued that Robert had mental disorders and problems with an adequate perception of reality caused by taking strong painkillers that a doctor had once prescribed for him. Moreover, in order to combat the side effects of these drugs, the man was prescribed even more medications, which ultimately only exacerbated his mental disorders. All this, according to the defenders, led to irrational behavior and the inability to fully control his own actions. In addition, the defense emphasized that the defendant suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. Due to such a line of Robert's lawyers, he could well have been found insane and sent for compulsory psychiatric treatment instead of a real term behind bars. So when the court session had been going on for more than 2 hours, the prosecutors decided to compromise and offer the accused a plea bargain. According to this agreement, the charges of first-degree intentional murder were removed from Robert, and instead, he was only charged with 2 episodes of second-degree murder and robbery. Thus, the defendant actually avoided responsibility even for the death of Christie's unborn child. Robert decided to accept these terms and fully admitted his guilt in the crimes charged against him. In the end, the court passed a sentence 74 years in prison with the right to parole no earlier than 60 years. When the defendant was given the last word, he addressed the families of his victims with assurances that he deeply regretted what he had done. Robert claimed that he was not really a bad person, and the deceased were his friends, whom he did not wish any harm at all. He said that it was all a tragic accident, nothing more. However, none of the defendant's excuses found a response from those present at the hearing. His version of events seemed completely absurd and implausible. Even if we take at face value the story about the accident and the unintentional double running over of the couple, Robert's subsequent actions raised many questions. After all, there was a possibility that the accident victims survived and needed immediate medical attention. However, instead of checking their condition and calling an ambulance, the man simply took the battered bodies home and cold-bloodedly mutilated them there. For his part, the medical examiner who worked on the case expressed doubts that the nature of the injuries of the deceased corresponded to the version of events voiced by Robert. True, given the poor preservation of the remains, the specialist could not reconstruct the circumstances of the couple's death with 100% certainty. The defendant himself could not in any way explain what motive prompted him to commit such cruel and inhuman acts. His belated apologies did not make any impression on the relatives of the murdered and did not make them soften their position. The families of Christy and Joseph did not hide their indignation and righteous anger. They wanted the killer to suffer behind prison walls until the end of his days, and after death, he would forever end up in the flames of hell. Their desire was not surprising, because even seasoned law enforcement officials called this crime one of the most chilling and disturbing in the entire history of their service in this small town. Despite the fact that the perpetrator of the tragedy was finally behind bars, the case did not end there. Detectives continued to work on the mysterious disappearance of Zeb Quinn, aiming to bring a new charge against Robert in this case, which had been in the archives of unsolved crimes for 15 years. In 2018, the defendant finally made an unexpected statement. Robert assured that he was not involved in the murder of his 18-year-old friend. At the same time, he revealed new details to the investigation that allegedly shed light on the true circumstances of that chilling event. According to Robert, Zeb's disappearance and death were orchestrated by his own uncle, Walter Gene Owens. The man allegedly personally developed a plan to rob and kill the trusting young man. To lure Zeb to the place of the massacre, the uncle, together with Robert, enticed the love-struck boy to the Uwharrie National Forest under the pretext of meeting his girlfriend Massie. It was probably a message about this date that Zeb sent to his aunt's pager shortly before his disappearance. However, at the appointed place, the deceived Romeo was not met by the embraces of his beloved, but by 2 armed men with criminal intentions. As Robert claimed, it was his uncle Walter who shot Zeb with a .22 caliber hunting rifle without hesitation, in order to deprive the boy of the opportunity to resist or seek help from the police. After that, the uncle allegedly mutilated the body into parts and then burned the remains. In this horrific story, an eerie analogy was clearly traced. Both relatives, it seems, got rid of the bodies of their victims in the same way. This detail only heightened suspicions about Robert's leading role in these atrocities. However, the defendant continued to insist on his own non-involvement in the murder of his friend. He said that only under pressure from his uncle did he become an unwitting accomplice in concealing the traces of the crime. Moreover, Robert assured that if the cops carefully examined the crime scene in the national park, they would surely find physical evidence that would confirm his testimony. The police officers immediately went to the specified area, but despite all their efforts, they could not find a single clue. Apparently, over the 15 years that had passed, natural processes and wild fauna had destroyed almost all possible traces of the bloody drama. Law enforcement officers failed to find even the used cartridges from the weapon mentioned by Robert at the scene. Of course, the most logical step in this situation would be to turn to Walter Owens for explanations, but unfortunately, this opportunity was lost forever. The uncle died of a heart attack back in 2017, so no one could confirm or refute Robert's testimony anymore. It seems that the investigation into the circumstances of Zeb's death reached the same dead end as the case of the murder of the Cote couple. Prosecutors who did not believe this latest version of the hardened criminal eventually decided to make a deal with the investigation. On July 25, 2022, Robert was offered to plead guilty to first-degree intentional murder of Zeb in exchange for leniency. The defendant accepted the terms of the agreement and, according to the verdict, received an additional 13 years in prison, which was added to his current term. Since then, Robert Owens has continued to serve his sentence in the Federal Correctional Institution in Madison County, North Carolina. Taking into account the fact that this unscrupulous criminal is the only witness to the deaths of 3 innocent people, it is quite likely that we will never know the whole truth about their deaths. However, for the general public, law enforcement officials unequivocally state that it is Robert Owens who is responsible for these terrible crimes, and he alone is guilty of what was committed.